A black SUV sat under the morning sun in downtown Chicago, its windows reflecting the glass towers around Millennium Park. Tourists snapped photos at Cloudgate, the silver beam mirroring their laughter. No one noticed the thin curl of smoke rising from the hood. No one saw the teddy bear slip off a booster seat inside, but a 6-year-old girl selling peppermint sticks on the sidewalk did. Her name was Aria Santos. When she pressed her face to the hot glass, she found a small boy slumped against the straps, his lips pale, his chest barely moving. And just like that, the ordinary street morning became a fight between life and death. Before we go further, tell me, what would you do if it were your child? Would you freeze or break through glass with your bare hands? Stay with me, because what happened next not only saved a boy, but shook the entire life of his billionaire father in ways no one could have imagined. Aria's heart pounded as she yanked at the locked handle. The sun had turned the car into an oven, and the little boy inside was too weak to answer her pounding fists. His eyes fluttered, then closed. Aria spun around, searching. People walked by, some curious, most pretending not to see. She spotted a brick near a construction barrier. It was nearly as heavy as her, but she gripped it with both hands. Lifting until her arms shook, she slammed it against the glass. A spiderweb crack blossomed, but held. Her skin stung from the rebound. She swung again, harder teeth clenched, remembering her mother's voice from the night before. We help, even if no one helps us. Blocks away, 67 floors up in Willis Tower, Maxwell Grant was guiding a boardroom full of executives through a multi-million-dollar logistics deal. His schedule was airtight, his tone precise, his attention absolute. His phone buzzed, face down on the table, flashing the word emergency. He ignored it once, then again, too committed to numbers on a screen to imagine danger unfolding in the streets below. Aria hit the window a third time. This one sliced her forearm, blood streaking the already fractured glass. A hiss of smoke leaked from the hood. She screamed, but the crowd kept moving, telling themselves someone else would step in. The boy's teddy bear lay on the floor by his feet, its stitched smile facing down. She wedged her small fingers into the split, ignoring the sting, and pulled until the glass gave way with a groan. Shards rained onto the seat. The door still wouldn't budge, child lock. Smoke thickened in the air. Maxwell's phone lit up again. His house manager's voice came through when he finally answered Mr. Grant. Theo isn't at preschool. They just called. He never arrived. For the first time in years, his blood ran cold. He didn't excuse himself. He didn't apologize. He just pushed back from the table, muttered, "Meeting's over," and bolted for the stairs. Back in the lot, Aria braced one foot on the car frame and kicked. The door jolted an inch. She kicked again, the metal whining in protest. On the third try, it flew open, releasing a blast of heat. She crawled in, arms shaking, and dragged the limp boy across the seat. His sneaker caught on the belt buckle. She yanked it free, falling backward with his weight. Smoke bit her throat as she carried him into the strip of shade beside a parking sign. "Stay with me," she whispered, pressing her palm to his chest. His eyelids twitched, his lips parted, and the faintest breath pushed through. Sirens wailed closer. Firefighters sprinted into the lot as the hood flame licked higher. A paramedic reached for Aria, eyes wide at the cuts on her arms. "Sweetheart, how old are you?" "6," she answered quickly, never looking away from the boy. He was going to die. Maxwell turned the corner just in time to see his son lying in a stranger's lap. He dropped to his knees, business suit forgotten voice cracking as he said, "Theo." The boy's eyes opened watery and accusing. "You left me," he whispered. Those 3 words struck Maxwell harder than any boardroom battle ever had. And in that moment, as smoke curled upward and his child clung weakly to life, a billionaire understood that everything he thought unshakable, his power, his control, his pride, was about to be rewritten by the courage of a poor girl with bleeding hands. At Northwestern Memorial Hospital, 2 sets of doors banged open almost at once. One gurney carried Theo Grant, the billionaire's son, pale beneath a tangle of blonde hair. Another rolled in a much smaller figure, Aria Santos, her forearms streaked with dried blood from shattered glass. The ER team split, moving with quiet urgency. Within seconds, Theo had an oxygen mask on an IV in his arm, and wires tracing the rhythm of his tiny heart. Across the corridor, a resident cleaned the cuts on Aria's skin, muttering under his breath that she had no business being this brave at 6 years old. Maxwell Grant stood in the middle, suit jacket, gone shirt, clinging to his back. The CEO, who once controlled entire markets, couldn't control the rising fear in his chest. He wanted to sit beside his son, but couldn't take his eyes off the girl who had saved him. She barely flinched when a nurse stitched her arm, though her jaw trembled with exhaustion. When the nurse asked her name, she said it plainly, Aria, as if she didn't realize the city would be speaking it by morning. Detectives from the Chicago Police Department approached, notebooks ready. "Mr. Grant, we need a statement." Leaving a child unattended. One look at Maxwell's face made the officer stop. He wasn't dodging responsibility. He was drowning in it. Later, he said, his voice raw. Not now, not with him lying there. In the waiting area, Aria shifted on the chair, her denim jacket stiff with soot. A social worker knelt to meet her eyes, asking about family. That's when the story cracked wider open. Aria explained she lived with her mother Sophia, who had been sick for months. She sold candy near the park to buy medicine. She didn't say it like a plea for pity. She said it the way children do when they've repeated the truth too many times. The social worker scribbled quickly, her gaze flicking toward Maxwell, already calculating the tangle of custody neglect charges and possible intervention. Maxwell listened, his hands clenching into fists. He thought about his conference room, the polished table still covered in untouched charts. None of it mattered now, his son's voice. "You left me," kept echoing, every syllable sharper than the last. But Aria's story pierced him differently. The girl who had saved his child was living in a one-room apartment with a mother too sick to stand. Her strength was survival, her courage born from necessity. A doctor approached, adjusting his glasses. "Mr. Grant, Theo's stable for now. Dehydration, mild heat stroke smoke, inhalation. We'll monitor him closely." Relief hit hard, then dissolved into guilt. Maxwell forced a nod, and the girl. The doctor's tone softened. "Surface lacerations. She's tougher than most adults I've seen today." Across the hall, a commotion rose. Sophia Santos had been brought into the same hospital only an hour earlier. Her pneumonia had worsened overnight. She was in respiratory distress, wheeled straight toward ICU. Aria saw the stretcher, dropped her candy box, and cried out, "Mama." She tried to run, but her legs buckled. A nurse caught her, holding her back gently. "She needs help right now, sweetheart. Let the doctors do their job." Maxwell froze, watching the small girl who had risked everything for his son now facing the possibility of losing the only family she had. He wanted to move to speak, but nothing came out. His assistant finally arrived, breathless, and whispered about investors, furious that he had abandoned the negotiation. Maxwell didn't answer. For once, the market could rage without him. The sight of Aria reaching out for her mother cut deeper than any boardroom loss. Later, as the night settled over River North, Maxwell sat beside Theo's bed, his son's small fingers curled around his hand. The monitors hummed, steady, reassuring. Across the hall, through a narrow window, he could see Aria curled on a plastic chair outside the ICU doors, her knees tucked to her chest. She refused to leave until someone told her about her mother. A nurse draped a blanket over her shoulders. She didn't notice. The social worker returned, voice quiet but firm. "Mr. Grant, there's a chance the state may step in if her mother doesn't recover. Do you understand what that means?" He nodded slowly, eyes still fixed on the girl. "Yes, I understand." The unthinkable truth pressed against him. In a single day he had nearly lost his own child and stumbled into the life of another who carried more weight than any 6-year-old should. The difference was money. He had more than he could spend, while Aria had less than enough to survive. Yet, in the only moment that mattered, it was she, not him, who had stepped forward and saved a life. As midnight passed, Maxwell walked into the waiting room, where Aria sat, her hands wrapped around the straps of her worn backpack. She looked up, her eyes too old for her age. "Is my mama going to die?" she asked, voice small but steady. He knelt in front of her, the man who had built an empire, suddenly at the mercy of a child's question. "She's fighting," he said quietly, "and we're not leaving her alone." The words surprised him, but as soon as he said them, he knew they were true. This wasn't about obligation or image. It was about something stripped down and raw love, loyalty, and a debt he couldn't measure in dollars. He had spent years chasing power, but tonight in the fluorescent hum of a hospital corridor, a poor girl had reminded him of what it meant to truly be human. He looked through the glass at Sophia Santos, pale and struggling machines breathing for her. Then he looked back at Aria, who had saved Theo without hesitation. In that moment, Maxwell Grant made a quiet vow that would alter everything. He would not walk away. Not from his son, not from this girl, not from her mother. Whatever came next, he was already in it. The story of a 6-year-old girl pulling a billionaire's son out of a burning car spread across Chicago like wildfire. By sunrise the next morning, every local news station had the footage of flashing ambulances outside Millennium Park, paired with shaky phone videos of a tiny child with blood on her arms. The headline was simple, brutal, and impossible to ignore: "Street Kid Saves Billionaire's Son." Within hours it had gone national. Maxwell Grant, the man who once prided himself on controlling every narrative, was now part of one he could not contain. Inside Northwestern Memorial, the hospital corridors hummed with reporters waiting for a glimpse of him. His security team tried to push them back, but cameras still caught him slipping into Theo's room or sitting outside the ICU where Sophia Santos lay unconscious. The image of a billionaire father beside a girl who sold candy on the streets was too stark, too compelling to fade quickly. Investors called furious about the collapse of his Trans-Pacific deal. The board demanded explanations. Maxwell ignored them all. For the first time in years, the market could move without him. Theo improved slowly, color returning to his cheeks, but he refused to let go of his father's hand. At night he still whispered, "You left me," a phrase that pierced Maxwell deeper than any headline. He stayed at his son's bedside, reading stories in a halting voice, feeding him spoonfuls of broth, learning the simple rituals of care that had never fit into his calendar before. What money could not buy presence restored. Across the hall, Aria refused to leave her mother. Nurses tried to coax her into the lounge to rest, but she sat stubbornly on the plastic chair, outside the ICU door, knees pulled tight to her chest, her peppermint box now battered and empty. Maxwell saw her there one morning, chin on her knees, staring at the floor. He asked a nurse to bring cocoa, then sat down beside her. She looked at the paper cup in his hand, as if it were a fragile treasure. "I can't drink it," she whispered. "What if Mama wakes up and I'm not here?" Maxwell didn't push. He simply set the cup beside her and stayed until her breathing evened out. She fell asleep leaning against the wall, a child finally too tired to keep watch. The next day, a social worker returned carrying forms and a clipboard. She explained in careful professional tones that if Sophia did not recover soon, the state might intervene. Aria would need placement, at least temporary, to ensure her safety. Aka. Maxwell listened, his jaw tight. The words state custody made his stomach twist. He thought of Theo's frightened whisper of Aria's small voice, asking if her mother would die. He had always believed problems could be solved with strategy, with capital, with force. But this problem required something different. It required promises. That afternoon, Maxwell made his first one. He told Aria that as long as her mother fought, she would never be alone. It wasn't a line crafted for a press release. It was raw, uncalculated, born in the same way her courage had been the day before, instinctively, without hesitation. Aria studied his face as if testing the truth of his words. When she finally nodded, he knew the weight of that trust was heavier than any deal he had ever signed. But the world outside the hospital did not pause for trust. By evening, financial outlets were buzzing with speculation about his future. Stock in Grant Global dipped. Anonymous sources whispered that the board was considering removing him as CEO. The media spun his absence from the deal room as negligence. Yet, in the middle of that storm, Maxwell found himself sitting cross-legged on the floor of Theo's hospital room building block towers with his son and the girl who had saved him. Cameras could write what they wanted. This was where he belonged. The following morning, something unexpected happened. Members of the community organized a small vigil at Cloud Gate, the place where the SUV had nearly become a coffin. Parents came with their children, holding candles, telling stories about bravery and loss. A local pastor spoke briefly, reminding everyone that sometimes heroes wore sneakers with holes and carried candy boxes instead of capes. Maxwell had not planned to attend, but Aria asked if she could go. She wanted her mother to know people were praying. So, for the first time in his life, Maxwell stood in front of a crowd, not as a businessman, not as a negotiator, but as a father and as a man indebted to a child. When he stepped up to the microphone, silence fell. Cameras clicked. He looked down at Aria, her hand still bandaged, clutching Theo's smaller one. "My son is alive because of her," he said, simply, his voice carrying across the plaza. "I spent years thinking I understood value numbers, contracts, margins, but none of it means anything compared to the courage of a little girl who refused to walk past smoke. She reminded me what matters, and I will not forget it." The crowd erupted in applause, not for him, but for Aria, who looked startled as strangers chanted her name. Maxwell bent and whispered, "They're cheering for you." She shook her head. For Mama, too, she corrected, her loyalty shining even in the spotlight. But hope is never steady. That night, a nurse rushed into the waiting area with urgent news Sophia had slipped into septic shock. Her body was failing, the infection spreading too fast. Aria's cry cut through the sterile corridor like glass breaking. She grabbed Maxwell's sleeve with both hands. "Don't let her die. Please, don't leave us." Her eyes, wide and desperate, forced him to confront a truth. Money couldn't erase. Sometimes all a promise could do was hold a hand in the dark. He followed the doctors into the ICU, standing at the edge of machines and wires, feeling utterly powerless. For a man who had commanded entire industries, the sight of a fragile woman on a hospital bed, her daughter sobbing in the hallway, was unbearable. He made another promise, then whispered more to himself than anyone else. If Sophia survived, he would make sure their lives were no longer a daily fight against hunger and fear. And if she didn't, he would not let Aria fall into the cracks of a system that measured children in case numbers. Through that long night, Maxwell stayed near the ICU doors while Theo slept under a nurse's care. Aria curled on the chair again, her small hand gripping his wrist, as if he were an anchor she refused to release. Her trust bound him more tightly than any contract. For years, he had equated responsibility with shareholders' deadlines and quarterly reports. Now he realized true responsibility was smaller, heavier, and infinitely more human. It was the weight of a child leaning on you because there was no one else. When dawn broke, Chicago's skyline caught the first light glass towers burning with gold. Maxwell watched the city he thought he owned and felt for the first time how fragile his own foundation had been. He had lived in a fortress of numbers, but one little girl with nothing but courage had broken through. Now, standing between his son and hers, between wealth and poverty, between life and death, he knew that whatever the cost, he was bound by the promises he had made. And some promises, unlike deals, cannot be broken. The hospital at night was a place of strange stillness. Machines pulsed and whispered, nurses moved with quiet steps, and the city outside seemed to disappear behind thick glass. For Maxwell Grant, it became a second home. He no longer thought about time. He sat between Theo's bed and the ICU where Sofia Santos lay, caught between two fragile lives that had rewoven the fabric of his own. Theo was recovering, though the fear had not left him. He clutched his father's hand even in sleep, his small fingers locking tight as if to test whether his father would vanish again. Aria never left the ICU doors, but each night she slid into the chair beside Maxwell for a while, drawing pictures on scraps of paper nurses gave her. One evening, she handed him a sketch of 3 stick figures under a sun, a boy, a girl, and a taller figure holding both their hands. She said nothing as she gave it to him, but he folded the paper carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket as though it were a contract written in gold. Sophia's condition was precarious. The doctors spoke in measured tones, mentioning antibiotics, blood cultures, organ stress. Maxwell listened to every word, interrupting only to ask for options, second opinions, transfers if necessary. He had lawyers draft an immediate trust in Aria's name, covering tuition health care and guardianship contingencies. He signed documents in the quiet corners of the ICU corridor, each signature not a calculation but a surrender to responsibility. For years, he had signed deals that shaped global markets. None carried the gravity of signing his name for a child who wasn't his by-blood but had already become his by-bond. The board of Grant Global demanded a meeting. The whispers had turned into open rebellion. Stockholders were pressing for answers, some calling for his resignation. For the first time, Maxwell didn't hide. He asked his assistant to set up the meeting inside the hospital's family lounge, a decision that shocked everyone who walked through those doors. On the screen, directors appeared stern and impatient. Maxwell listened as they accused him of neglecting duty, abandoning the deal, and tarnishing the company's reputation. He let them finish. Then, with Aria asleep in the corner, her head resting against the wall, he spoke plainly. "I walked out of a meeting to save my son," he said. "I would do it again. If this board believes I should be punished for that, then remove me. I'll remain as chair if you'll allow it, but I will not return as CEO. From this day forward, my time belongs first to my son and to the commitments I've made here." Silence followed. Some directors argued, others pleaded, but Maxwell didn't waver. For years, he had led with numbers. Now he led with conviction. He chose to step down not as defeat but as liberation. The company would continue. He had different work to do. That same night, the Chicago Fire Department sent a lieutenant to check on Aria. He was the one who had arrived moments after she dragged Theo out too late to stop her from slicing her arms on the glass. He carried a small orange rescue hammer, the kind kept in emergency vehicles. He placed it in her hands and showed her how to strike corners of a window, not the center, how the glass would shatter safely. Aria listened wide-eyed, practicing her grip. "Next time you won't get hurt," he told her. Maxwell watched quietly, struck by the symbolism the city was teaching her the skill she had earned through courage, giving her back a piece of safety. Later, Aria slipped the hammer into her backpack beside her peppermint box. She said softly, "Now I can help without bleeding." For Maxwell, it felt like the beginning of something he couldn't quite name. Hours later, just as the night seemed longest, Sophia stirred. Her eyelids fluttered, her chest rose with effort, and her lips parted to whisper her daughter's name. Nurses rushed in, adjusting tubes, checking monitors, but the single syllable Aria was louder than any alarm. Aria rushed to the bedside, clutching her mother's frail hand. Tears ran down her cheeks as she whispered, "I'm here, Mama. I didn't leave you." Maxwell stood back, every muscle in his body taut. Sophia's gaze drifted weak, but searching until it landed on him. Her voice cracked rough as sandpaper, but she spoke. The man they keep saying is helping us." He nodded, not trusting his voice. "Yes," he said finally, "but it's your daughter who saved us all." Her hand trembled as it squeezed Aria's fingers. Then her eyes closed again, exhausted, but no longer lost. The monitors steadied. The doctors exchanged hopeful glances. She had survived the night. After the medical team left the room, settled into a hush, broken only by the rhythmic beep of machines, Aria leaned against her mother's bed, her face glowing with relief. Theo tiptoed in, holding his teddy bear, and placed it gently by Sophia's pillow. "For when you wake up again," he said shyly. Aria smiled through tears. Maxwell felt something shift deep inside him. This was no longer just about rescuing or paying debts or correcting mistakes. It was about building a life where these children and the fragile woman who tied them together could stand without fear. He walked into the hallway, pulling the folded drawing from his pocket. The three stick figures stared back at him. It was a child's vision, but it was also a blueprint. For the first time in years, Maxwell saw a future that didn't depend on stock charts or quarterly goals. It depended on showing up, staying, and refusing to walk away. The long night had broken, and with the morning came a turning point he could never undo. The weeks that followed didn't look like anything Maxwell Grant had ever known. For years, his calendar was stacked with international flights, closed-door negotiations, and late nights where deals mattered more than dinners. Now, mornings began with Theo tugging on his sleeve, asking him to pour cereal or read one more page of a book before school. Evenings ended not in a penthouse office but at Sophia's small rental house, where laughter came from two children building forts out of couch cushions and arguments revolved around who got the last chocolate chip cookie. Sophia's recovery was slow but steady. With Maxwell covering medical costs, she no longer worried about whether antibiotics would run out before her strength returned. She focused on healing, resting when she needed to, letting herself trust that someone else could shoulder part of the burden. At first, she resisted the idea of relying on Maxwell. Pride had kept her standing for so long she didn't know how to lean on another. But she saw the way Theo held Aria's hand at the park, how Maxwell bent down to tie Aria's shoes when her fingers were clumsy with bandages, and she realized this wasn't charity. This was family growing in unexpected soil. Maxwell's resignation as CEO of Grant Global hit the financial press like a thunderclap. Headlines screamed of downfall and scandal. Commentators speculated about mental breakdowns or hidden legal battles. What they didn't understand was that Maxwell had walked away not in disgrace, but in freedom. He still held a board seat and more wealth than his grandchildren could ever spend, but money no longer defined his worth. What defined him now was walking into a modest classroom on Chicago's South Side, shaking hands with teachers and telling them he wanted to personally see that Aria had every resource she needed. The look on her face when she saw her name on a desk, her very own desk, was worth more than any dividend check. He began spending weekends differently, too. Instead of golf with executives, he drove Theo and Aria to Lincoln Park Zoo, or the Field Museum, places he had passed countless times but never truly entered. He watched Aria marvel at the lions, her hand pressed to the glass, whispering facts she had read in library books. He listened as Theo explained dinosaurs with the authority of a budding paleontologist, his eyes alight with excitement. These were investments too, just of a different kind. They were deposits into a future where curiosity mattered more than contracts. One Saturday evening, as the children sprawled across the living room floor with crayons, Sophia sat across from Maxwell at her kitchen table. She had color returning to her cheeks, though her voice still carried the rasp of recovery. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "You've done more for us in weeks than I could have done in years." Maxwell shook his head. "No, Sophia. I should be the one thanking you. Aria didn't just save Theo. She saved me. She reminded me what it means to actually live. Money gave me walls. Your daughter gave me windows." Sophia's eyes softened. "It's not easy for me to accept help, but you've never made us feel like charity cases. You've treated us like equals." "Because you are," Maxwell replied. "I spent years chasing numbers, but I never felt rich until I sat here in this kitchen watching Aria laugh with my son." Their eyes held for a moment, the silence filled with a shared understanding. Wealth was no longer about stock indexes. It was about the fragile, beautiful act of showing up for one another. The turning point came when Theo's school hosted a family day. Maxwell had skipped dozens of such events in the past, always claiming urgent meetings. This time, he cleared his schedule completely. He arrived early, walking hand in hand with Theo and Aria Sophia just behind them. Parents and teachers whispered everyone knew who Maxwell Grant was, the billionaire who once ruled corporate towers. But that day, he wasn't a headline. He was just a dad carrying a paper plate of cupcakes his son had insisted on bringing. When Theo introduced him to his classmates, his voice carried pride instead of hesitation. "This is my dad," he said simply, and Maxwell felt the weight of years of absence dissolve in that one moment. Aria chimed in. "And this is my friend. He's like my second dad." The children accepted it without question. To them, it didn't matter whose blood ran in whose veins. What mattered was who showed up to clap during the school play, who bent down to tape a torn sneaker, who laughed the loudest during a messy art project. That night, after the children were asleep, Maxwell drove home and walked into his cavernous mansion. It was pristine, polished, silent. For the first time, he realized how empty it truly was. The marble floors echoed with absence. The dining table sat like a monument to loneliness. He stood in the middle of his living room and whispered aloud, "This isn't wealth. That is." He could still hear Theo's laughter in his mind, still see Aria proudly holding up her school art. He knew where he belonged. In the months that followed, Maxwell downsized. He kept the mansion but moved his life into a smaller townhouse closer to Sophia and Aria. It was warm, filled with books and photos instead of board reports and abstract art. He hung the stick figure drawing Aria had made the first week they met in the entryway, framed not in gold but in simple wood. Every visitor asked about it, and Maxwell told the story without shame. "This drawing is worth more to me than every dollar I've ever earned," he'd say. Aria thrived in school, her natural brilliance shining through now that she had resources and support. Theo flourished too, more confident, more open, no longer a boy carrying silent loneliness. Together they became inseparable, teaching each other resilience and joy. Sophia, growing stronger, started volunteering part-time at a local clinic, wanting to give back after all she had received. And Maxwell. He discovered a new rhythm to life. He still attended board meetings occasionally, but they no longer consumed him. He gave speeches not about profits, but about purpose, telling audiences of executives that true wealth wasn't measured in billions but in bedtime stories, in the courage of a child who refuses to walk away from danger in the fragile chance to start again. Some scoffed, some dismissed him, but others listened, and slowly his words began to ripple outward. One spring afternoon, he found himself back at the park where everything had begun. The sky was blue, the air alive with laughter. Theo and Aria chased each other across the grass, their voices high and unburdened. Sophia sat on a bench nearby, sunlight glinting in her hair. Maxwell watched them, his heart full in a way it had never been before. He realized then that his wealth had multiplied, not in numbers, but in moments, moments of redemption, of love, of belonging. For the rest of his life, people would still call him a billionaire. But in his own heart, Maxwell Grant carried a different title, one far rarer and infinitely more valuable, a man who had finally learned what it meant to be rich. Maxwell Grant's story began with the sound of breaking glass and the cry of a child. In a single morning, his world, once consumed by contracts, skyscrapers, and the blind pursuit of more, was ripped open by the bravery of a little girl with nothing but determination in her hands. What started as a rescue from a burning car became something far greater, the rescue of a father who had forgotten what truly mattered. Aria Santos, small and fragile on the outside, carried a strength that rewrote the course of a billionaire's life. And Theo, the boy who whispered, "You left me," became the compass that forced Maxwell to confront not only his failures, but also his chance at redemption. The aftermath was not simple. It was messy, full of guilt, healing, and rebuilding. Maxwell, a man who once believed power was measured in assets, learned to measure it instead in presence. He discovered that wealth was not the gleam of boardroom tables, but the glow in his son's eyes when he showed up for him, truly showed up. He found it in Aria's smile when she realized she belonged in a classroom, her name written proudly on a desk. And he found it in Sophia's quiet gratitude, the kind that grew not from material gifts, but from shared responsibility and respect. This journey was not about erasing mistakes, it was about transforming them. Maxwell could never undo the hours. Theo spent crying in a hot car, never rewrite the years he spent absent, but he could change what came next, and he did. He traded deals for dinners, power for purpose, and in doing so he built something far more enduring than any company. He built a family, stitched together by courage, forgiveness, and love. The lesson here reaches beyond Maxwell Grant's fortune or his fall. It's a mirror for all of us. In a world where we are pulled constantly toward deadlines, distractions, and the illusion of more, it is dangerously easy to forget the very people who give life its meaning. The truth is simple but profound. No amount of money, status, or success can replace the quiet joy of being present for those we love. Real wealth lies not in accumulation, but in connection in the hands we hold, the voices we listen to, and the time we choose to give. Aria's courage teaches us another truth, that one act of bravery, even from the smallest among us, can change the course of lives forever. It reminds us that our worth isn't defined by what we own, but by what we're willing to do when someone else needs us most. Courage doesn't always look like strength. Sometimes it looks like a child refusing to walk away when everyone else does. So as you reflect on this story, ask yourself, where are you investing your time, your attention, your heart? What would it look like to measure success? Not by what you earn, but by who you become and the lives you touch along the way. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the true meaning of wealth, courage, and family, then I invite you to be part of this journey with us. Subscribe to our channel, leave a comment about what touched you most, and share this with someone who needs a reminder today. Your support gives us the strength to keep creating stories that inspire challenge and remind us all of what truly matters. Because together we can keep learning, keep growing, and keep choosing the kind of wealth that no one can ever take away.